George, and I'll be presenting on childhood trauma, the brain, and future success. To begin, why is childhood trauma really a problem? Well, according to SAMHSA.gov, 1 in 7 children has experienced childhood abuse in the past year. This statistic goes to illustrate just how prevalent the problem of childhood abuse actually is. Now, let's look at what I'll be covering in this presentation. First, I will discuss what childhood trauma is and why it is important to learn about. Then, I'll go into the brain. Here, I will cover gray matter abnormalities, hippocampal and amygdala abnormalities, fear neurocircuitry being changed, function having to adapt, and changes in the white matter reward tracks. Then I will switch gear to future success, and here I'll be discussing facing future adversities, future relationship success, and educational attainment rates. Let's jump into the overview. Why is childhood trauma really important to talk about? Childhood abuse is present worldwide, not just in the United States. Childhood abuse is defined as the physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, or a combination of multiple types of abuse, or neglect of a child. According to SAMHSA.gov, 1,840 children died from some sort of abuse or neglect in the United States in 2019. While the statistic may be a bit dated, it really demonstrates how detrimental childhood abuse can be to a child. Abuse is not only terrible for the child, but it also impacts the way the child grows up, their future success, their brain, and their mental health. Now, let's jump into looking at the brain. We'll start by examining gray matter volume abnormalities. One of the major changes in the gray matter volumes can be seen in depressed abused participants. According to Ringwald et al., the gray matter volumes in depressed abused participants were much smaller in the orbitofrontal cortex. The orbitofrontal cortex is involved in emotional regulation. Other brain areas that are reduced are the medial frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex, as Yang et al. Have demonstrated through their research. These areas are involved in complex mental activities, attention inhibition, abstract reasoning, and decision making. According to Yang et al., another area of the brain that is impacted the most is the posterior cingulate cortex. This area is involved in regulating and mediating interactions between emotion and memory. The last areas that are impacted are the cerebellum and the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which was also demonstrated by Yang et al. These areas are involved in complex motor functions. The areas that are impacted can have drastic effects on the child's brain and the ability for the child to function. When these areas are reduced, the child's ability to do things such as complex mental activities, attention-keeping tasks, and emotional regulation is reduced. Now let's discuss the hippocampal and amygdala volumes. According to Fogwe et al., the hippocampus plays a major role in learning and memory. According to Abu Hassan et al., the amygdala plays a major role in fear conditioning, regulates anxiety and aggression, and deals with emotional memory and social cognition. When these areas are reduced in volume, it can greatly impact their functioning and the functioning of the child. According to Weissman et al., exposure to violence is correlated with smaller than average hippocampal and amygdala volumes. When these areas are reduced, it can impact the child's memory, anxiety and aggression regulation, and fear responses. According to both Rouge et al. And Weissman et al., reduced hippocampal volumes are implicated in the later development of both post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and depression. This means that the more reduced your hippocampal volumes are, the higher your risk for PTSD and depression. Now let's take a look at fear neurocircuitry. Exposure to violence and childhood abuse can impact the child in many ways. According to Rouge et al., exposure to violence impacts the fear responses and fear sensitivity. There is also an increased fear directing response, which means that the fear interpretation is much more sensitive and intense. This is due to the increased amygdala activation and reduced amygdala volumes, which, if you recall, the amygdala is involved in anxiety regulation. This is also due to being on high alert constantly as a child. Now let's examine functional brain networks and reward tracks. According to Gao et al., functional brain networks are networks that are involved in everyday functions. Some of these networks include sensory, visual, motor, attention, memory, and executive control. In these networks, there are switching rates. According to Huang et al., higher switching rates indicate a decreased stability of the functional brain network modules. These areas include the occipital, cingulo-orbicular, and the frontal-parietal subnetworks, areas implicated in the development of depression and schizophrenia. When these areas have higher than average switching rates, their functionality is decreased, leading to potential problems. Additionally, according to D. Ross et al., there is a relationship between childhood maltreatment and the small white matter accumbofrontal reward tract. When this tract is impacted, it leads to an increase in reward and risk-taking behavior, as well as a drastic increase in psychiatric disorders such as depression. Now let's switch gears and examine future success, specifically focusing on facing future adversities. According to Dovran et al., moderate to severe abuse were the highest risk factors for later school difficulties, school problems, adversities, and problems with mental health. Facing childhood maltreatment is also one of the highest risks and tells for revictimization, which means that the child will likely either enter into an abusive relationship later in life or will face abuse or maltreatment again. Additionally, the researchers found that the more exposure to childhood trauma one faces, the more adversities one will face later in life. Now let's examine future relationship success. Childhood maltreatment is associated with low adulthood romantic relationship quality, according to both River et al. And Unger and De Luca. According to Unger and De Luca, there is often more violence and insults in adult relationships where one or both partners have been abused in their childhood. Additionally, when a person experiences physical childhood abuse, they often develop an avoidant attachment style. Adding to this information, River et al. Discovered that low quality relationships are mediated by childhood maltreatment, meaning that childhood maltreatment was an indicator of low relationship quality in adulthood. Also, there were greater conflicts in romantic relationships, and they found that a specific type of abuse, neglect, was associated with lower partner support. Now let's take a look at educational attainment. According to Crouch et al., positive childhood experiences pave the way for school success. Being able to share with a parent and have them accept you is very important in development. In a nurturing environment, a safe, stable home, social engagement, managing emotions, and school success are all characteristics of a positive childhood experience, and all will lead to good educational attainment. There are less challenges with a stable home, and this is measured through absenteeism and repetition of a grade. When a child feels safe enough to share ideas with a caregiver, they are also less likely to repeat a grade. However, according to Cage, only 58% of maltreated children complete their education, which, in 2019, was 15% lower than the national average. This just shows how impactful childhood abuse and neglect can be on children and their future educational attainment. Finally, Cage discovered that the timing of the maltreatment was also vital to school success. Maltreatment in early life is more detrimental than maltreatment in the preteen and teenage years. This could be because of the sensitive periods that occur early in childhood. To continue, according to Tankana et al., those who suffered from childhood physical abuse were less likely to graduate than any other type of abuse. These children also have, on average, less years of education completed and are more likely to fail school and have poor school performance. Tankana et al. Also found an overlap with sexual assault victims, but they attribute this overlap in abuse types that many children will experience. To conclude our conversation, we have covered the brain and future success. We have covered gray matter abnormalities, increased fear responses, and reward tracks in the brain. We've also covered aspects of future success, including the adversities faced, relationship success, and educational attainments. I believe there are a few gaps in the literature. These gaps in the literature include lacking a focus on males experiencing childhood abuse, as many of the studies focused solely on females. Additionally, there were not many studies with adolescents. The researchers mainly utilized adults. My suggestion for future research would be to close these gaps in the literature by including males and adolescents in future research. I would also recommend having a larger sample size, as many researchers only had small sample sizes. And I would also recommend having more diversity in the population. This lack of diversity is in areas such as race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic statuses. To finalize this presentation, let's look at my research questions. The first potential research question I could utilize would be, is childhood trauma associated with lower grade point average, or GPA, in college-age undergraduate students? The second question I could use is childhood trauma implicated in the future development of depression and/or PTSD? Thank you for your time spent listening to this presentation.